Hello, depending on where you are. I'd like to begin by saying thank you very much to the two persons who are with me this afternoon. Conrad Tribble, who is DCM at the U.S. Embassy in Madrid, and the Secretary of State, Rafael Perez Ruiz, Secretary of State for Security. Thank you. And also other colleagues and scientists who will be closing today's session. We will be hearing from him afterwards. Fidel Santagorta, who is DG Foreign Policy. Thank you very much for being with us. This is the 8th time we participate in this Elcano Forum on Global Terrorism. We go back to 2013, and this continues to be a very important milestone every year in Spain, focusing on issues that have to do with terrorism, tendencies, and public policies with which to tackle terrorism and stem it. This new edition is possible thanks to our endeavors. We're focusing on radical violence and terrorism. It's a unique program in Spain, and one which I think enjoys international renown. So thank you to Fernando Linares, firstly, and Carola Garcia Calvo, and Vicente also. They have just completed a project, a European project, which has been very well received by European authorities. Mind Before Act is the name. It has to do with prevention of radical activities, which has kept them busy for 3 years in our entity. We have had friends from all over the European Union participating in this, and at the end of one, they have immediately segued into another one. The Instituto Elcano is now part of a consortium which the European Commission has just endowed with some funds, radicalization, etc. So for the upcoming 3 years, we are going to be working very hard along these lines. Now, the first time we met, we worked with the intense and ongoing contributions of the Embassy of the United States of America in Madrid. Thank you very much. And also thank you to the Instituto Internacional. Thank you very much for our hosts. We're very much at home. And for the second year in a row, we have the great luck of having with us the Secretary of State for Security, the Secretary of State himself. As we know, the Elcano and Secretariat of State have a very close working relationships thanks to a protocol which we signed months ago. A few days ago, I addressed the issue of a report on sub-Saharan Africa and business opportunities that are available in sub-Saharan Africa. And we said that we Spaniards tend to look up north, Europe. We look west, we look to Latin America, but we rarely look down south. And I think the time has come for us to begin to look down south, because the south is full of opportunities. We talked about business opportunities, we talked about Spanish companies, and we're going to talk about a south which also implies some risks. Global jihadism, as we know, is an ongoing issue which will not foreseeably be disappearing in the mid or short term, or its manifestation, which of course is jihadist terrorism. Over the past few years, furthermore, we have witnessed a reconfiguration of the agents and stakeholders involved in these activities as new scenarios crop to the surface. One of them, of course, is the Sahel. The Sahel, especially in its westernmost region, which is one of the world's scenarios where we have more rebel activity. Al-Qaeda, the group that supports Islam and Muslims, Al-Qaeda, and part of the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State for the Sahara, carries out its activities geared to terrorism in that part of the world. These organizations have escalated their activities, and they affect the stability and political and civilian security. First, Al-Baim, ever since its establishment back in 17, and the second, AIX, as of the following year, 2018. Competition, cooperation between and the other organization are of tremendous import and are a reason for us to think about the future. Of course, we have to remember that It is citizens' interests, Spanish interests, Western interests in that part of the world that are at stake. So to better debate these issues and to learn, we are very lucky to have with us this afternoon experts and professionals from Spain and the US, from countries that are firmly committed together with France in the fight against terrorism. All of you who are with us, all of you who will join us, thank you very much. Thank you very much for being with us today. Allow me to conclude then by once again saying thank you very much to the dignitaries who are going to take the floor. First, Mr. Tribble, then Mr. Perez-Ruiz. We will hear the keynote, and then we will segue into the first panel. Again, thank you. You have the floor, sir. Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. Hello to all. I'm very happy to be here. Let me first remove my mask, which is always very, very pleasant, but wear my mask afterwards, yes. I'm here in representation of the Embassy of the United States of America in Madrid, and I'm very honored to participate in this association with the Real Instituto Elcano. This is the 8th year in a row, and we are working to organize this forum on global terrorism. Let me begin then, I'll switch to English, but let me begin by saying thank you to Emilio, to Fernando, and Carola. Fernando, where are you? And our colleagues from the Real Instituto Elcano for their collaboration in the seminar this year, addressing the issues of jihadism and terrorism in the Sahel. Y paso al inglés. Paso al inglés.
Some of the points that I want to make are important, and I want to make sure that I make them effectively in my second month here in Spain. This forum is one of the things that we do. It serves a very vital role in our counterterrorism efforts because it allows experts, as Emilio said, from different regions and disciplines to share ideas, to come together, to think about and talk about what works, and to identify ways to strengthen our cooperation. I am pleased our embassy was able to help bring together two of the participants in the panel, in the seminar, two panelists, Catherine Zimmerman of the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. She's part of the Critical Threats Project, and a colleague of mine from the State Department, Matthew Nevins. He's a terrorism analyst for Africa in our Bureau of Intelligence and Research. That's our sort of long-term analysis shop in the State Department. Today's seminar focuses on the Sahel. This is a region that has become a key foreign policy priority for both the United States and Spain, especially. Both of our governments recognize that a secure, stable Sahel is in the best interests of our countries, and indeed of the region, and perhaps even the rest of the world. It's such importance we created a special envoy for the Sahel region in March. Meanwhile, Spain's foreign minister, who began her one-year position as the president of the Sahel Alliance in June, has made 2 trips there already and is set for another one later this month to the region. On the ground, our teams, Spanish and American, are working together to dismantle jihadist terrorist groups and criminal networks, to stimulate economic growth, to strengthen democratic institutions, to do all the things we both know are necessary to fight against the broad challenge of terrorism. The U.S. is the single largest donor of health, development, and humanitarian aid to the G5 Sahel countries, and so we will continue to do that. I think there will be no change in that because of our electoral change here in the coming months. This past year, the total U.S. humanitarian assistance, including for COVID-19 support, was almost $430 million US, but we're also trying to think about transitioning away from just humanitarian assistance to investing in people, in business, and in infrastructure. And so we've invested so far about $150+ million in programs for economic development in the Central Sahel. We signed a Millennium Challenge Compact Agreement worth nearly $500 million with Burkina Faso to double the number of households with access to affordable electricity, and so forth. Beyond the humanitarian and economic development challenges, we need to stay focused on addressing the root causes of violence, trying to stem its spread. Our Special Envoy for the Sahel talks about the crisis of Sahel as being one of state legitimacy. Citizens in these countries need to believe that their governments are valid, are equitable, and able to meet their citizens' needs. And that requires a focus on civilian protection, ensuring justice and accountability for human rights violations and abuses. And it requires the governments to themselves be committed to that. Without a country's commitment to meet the needs of its citizens, nothing we do, no degree of international engagement is likely to succeed. Countering terrorism in Africa, broadly speaking, remains a top U.S. priority, so we are collaborating with the governments in the region to help them better protect their civilians from terrorist attacks. This involves activities to try to constrain terrorist groups' ability to move and to operate, including through border security technologies, strengthening investigation techniques for terrorism, and strengthening justice systems to prosecute terrorist attacks, and improving the tactical response to attacks. And we will continue to support those efforts to develop accountable, professional security forces that extend the authority of the state and of good governance to be able to communicate better with the populations they serve and defend state sovereignty in these countries. To close, let me just underscore that the Sahel is a frequent topic of conversation with the Spanish government, between the United States and Spain at the ministerial level, between militaries, between our law enforcement authorities. It's one of the major elements of the U.S.-Spanish bilateral relationship, coordination and collaboration in and around and about the Sahel. And I include, as I think about that, the activities and the coordination and the collaboration between our military forces in places like Rota and Moron, because that's also a part of our presence here in Spain. We are very proud of this partnership with Spain and other NATO allies, and I expect that this cooperation on this region, on this issue of security in the Sahel, in Spain's south, with all the complex problems that it poses for our shared security, will only grow stronger in the coming year, even or despite or in addition to or in accompanying with the electoral and political changes that the United States will be going through. And so I don't think the transition will affect this area of good cooperation at all. Gracias nuevamente por la oportunidad de estar aquí hoy con ustedes, por a nuestros distinguidos oradores, usted y lo demás que viene.
Thank you to Elcano and the Ministry of the Interior in Spain. Thank you very much for working together with us in order to ensure the greatest possible success for this forum. Thank you, and enjoy the conversation. Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you very much for the collaboration. And let me say too that please, when you speak to the ambassador, please say on our behalf, thank you very much. So I'm happy to give the floor to the Secretary of State.
Dear Chairman of the Real Elcano Emilio, dear Ministry of Home Affairs, Mr. Conrad, I'm happy to be sharing the stage with Fernando and Carola, sorry. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for organizing this event and for giving me the opportunity to talk about the actions that we are carrying out in the ministry and for organizing today's event. Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. If you allow me, please, I'd like to start my welcoming words to the Real Instituto Elcano for inviting me to this opening session of the Forum on Global Terrorism. This is a space for reflection, which, as you have mentioned, Emilio, has been consolidated as one of the most relevant ones in this country. In spite of the fact that we are still immersed in the struggle against COVID-19, we shouldn't just relax ourselves vis-a-vis certain threats. Of course, terrorism is one of those. Actually, it is a phenomenon which is a priority that we need to struggle against. Be it with or without a health crisis, allow me to, therefore, before we open the forum, which is going to be held today, to briefly mention all of the victims of the CV coronavirus so that the relatives and the friends can somehow feel better. This is the first opportunity I have. By the way, it is a pleasure to attend this panel, and I attend here with some convictions in mind. The first one is that violence, terrorist violence, is a very complex phenomenon, a changing phenomenon also, which affects very seriously and directly society, but also the state. And therefore it requires an answer, a response which is integral and integrating both. As the national strategy that was approved in last year's National Council in 2019, one of the main lessons that we've learned in the struggle against terrorism in Spain is the efficiency of a firm determination to fight against terrorism, which is translated and must be translated into having the initiative vis-à-vis terrorists and in mobilizing all of the capacities of the state and of society as a whole. Therefore, apart from the work and the dedication of the security forces, we need research such as the type of research that the Real Institute Elcano carries out. And also at the universities, this type of research is geared towards establishing an analysis framework in order to get to know better a phenomenon which is constantly under transition, such as jihadism. Also, it has proven to be capable of mutating and adapting itself to new contexts. Therefore, we in the Secretariat of State of for security rather, we're promoting as much as possible the exchange for knowledge and for reflection. This task is the task where Real Instituto Elcano is one of the main protagonists, and the convention that you've just mentioned. Therefore, I want to make use of this opportunity to publicly acknowledge them and manifest my acknowledgement for their work that we carry out jointly. Thank you. Now, to the heart of the subject matter. The first thing we need to underline is that terrorism, international terrorism actually, of jihadist inspiration has been consolidated as the main terrorist threat for our country and also for the international community as a whole. The emergence, the consolidation, and the crisis of Daesh and the fight against Al-Qaeda for the leadership of the jihadist global movement have changed the terrorist threat in the last few years, and it's a very real threat. The attempts in France and in Austria have clearly proven that there's autonomous groups in Daesh and Al-Qaeda, and they are asking people to attack Eastern and Western, interests all over the world, European ones. This manifests the effectiveness of the jihadist propaganda as an element which is a motivating but also that confers orders. One of the main strategies promoted first by Al-Qaeda and then by Daesh has been to disseminate to similar groups all over the world in order to expand its power and organize and inspire the attacks in different countries, looking for a strong propaganda impact. One of the main relevant scenarios, such as Sahel, with active terrorist groups in all of the countries of Sahel, is the subject where this year the Elcano has decided to focus on. First in Africa, but also in Sahel, and therefore we may say that in the last few months the terrorist threat in the African continent has been influenced obviously by COVID-19, because the struggle against the virus has become a priority for the authorities, which has meant that they have deviated important efforts of the police forces in order to battle against the pandemics as a detriment, unfortunately, of the terrorist struggle. This is a struggle that also affects its Western interests, because it has decreased the presence of citizens in public spaces because of several factors, such as the expatriation of residents, staff, confinement or lock-up measures to limit the dissemination, and the prohibition of fighting to third countries adopted in our countries. And now if we just focus on the Sahel, even if the center for the terrorist threat is still Mali, but it is worrying really to see the security situation in Burkina Faso and Niger, where the attacks, murders, and kidnaps are still happening. Mali, which is still in the middle of a very serious political crisis after the coup d'etat of last August the 18th, the terrorist groups are still making use of the inter-ethnic conflicts and the social problems and local problems in the areas where they still have not been able to take the place of the state. They're creating political instability and tensions in order to increase their resources and their profits. In this scenario, the terrorist, anti-terrorist forces, international ones, are still the main objective of the terrorists, as I will be able to explain later. On the other hand, the fights against groups, Apoyo al-Islam and the Muslims, the group Islamic group of Greater Sahara that started last year, have increased, and they've also gone worse and more serious, finishing with the peace that they had for the period previous. Multinational forces have had some victories, but they still are not able to refrain the threat, and the terrorist groups are still adapting themselves to a new situation, and therefore they are still perpetrating attacks. This threat up to now is translated into implications for our country, such as the existence of a permanent risk for the Spanish interest in that region. We may consider that the main objective is, for the time being, the French interest, but it is still very high, the risk that is based on any Western asset, including the Spanish assets. These risks are still in force. Recently, the Daesh spokesperson said that yes, it is true that there's no specific threats towards Spain, but they launched the message to Muslims that live in different African countries, including Mali, Burkina Faso, and Chad, and he encourages them to join the caliphate, and he is threatening the missionaries and the politicians of Europe to evangelize. This interest specify itself in the possibility of terrorist attacks and also kidnaps of religious, military, civil forces, civilians who are in that area. As an example of this risk, I'm going to just mention the murder of the Salesian priest Antonio Cesar Fernandez, February last year, or the attack to the military of the mission of training of the European Union Mali, also in February last year, 2019, where there were 2 consecutive attacks with a bomb vehicle and the attack to the installations or facilities of the training center, where Spain has a force of over 300 soldiers. The risks in terrorist threat at an international level are not new. They were identified in 2006 in the Ministry of Domestic Affairs when they created a police group for the support. And this special support team, composed by members of the National Police and by members of the Civil Guard, one of the missions of them is the deployment when there is big terrorist attacks abroad in order to advise and cooperate in the investigation carried out by the judicial authorities and police authorities of the country. Once the terrorist threat has been discussed and the risks, now I'm going to try to analyze more in detail the most relevant things of the terrorist strategy of the Ministry of Domestic Affairs and the Secretariat of State for Security in order to struggle against the problem of terrorism within and outside of our borders. The Ministry of Domestic Affairs has decided to continue improving the mechanisms to struggle against terrorism by optimizing the capacity of prevention and response of the state vis-a-vis this phenomenon, having more resources and more capabilities. The experience Spain has in struggle against terrorism has proved that it is necessary to make an ongoing long-term effort that requires political determination and the implementation of social measures, police measures, and judicial measures also, firm and decided. Apart from implementing the law instruments that we had ourselves in the last few years to struggle against terrorism, we need to talk about several things. We need to give more importance to measures against prevention of radicalization and promote de-radicalization measures. Pass the regulation to prevent the dissemination of terrorist content in internet. We need to exchange intelligence more in depth, and we need to especially pay attention to the threat of terrorist fighters that have returned. In order to achieve these objectives, we're working in the Secretariat of State of Security basically along the following measures. Firstly, developing the national strategy against terrorism. At the beginning of 2019, the Council of National Security approved or passed the new strategy, National Strategy Against Terrorism, that presently is a priority in our department to fully develop all the action lines that make up this National Strategy Against Terrorism. It has 4 pillars: prevention, protection, prosecution, and preparing the response vis-à-vis terrorism. Number 2, a permanent and continuous assessment of the terrorist threat, with all the security and intelligence agents involved, and going to the prevention plan so that it can be implemented. Presently, you know that we are in level 4 in terms of alert. It's quite high, which means that every week we hold an assessment roundtable of terrorist threat, and therefore we adopt specific measures in terms of prevention and protection developed by the security forces. Also, struggle against violent radicalization. For that, last October the 6th, within the National Board of Security, we approved a new policy against violent radicalization, concentrating efforts and structures of the different administration with a clear local aspect. And there's something important also, that we include civil society. We want to prevent and prosecute the financing of terrorism. That's another action line which is important, and that is geared towards detecting and acting against terrorist networks in terms of microfinancing, but also in terms of connections, procedures, and techniques that link organized crime with terrorism. For that, recently also we have passed in the Council of National Security the Strategic National Plan against the financing of terrorism, which has the participation of all the agents also, all the stakeholders in this sector, by putting together efforts and generating synergies within the preventive system also. Prevention of terrorism is important also in jail and after jail also, because as a consequence of the efficient action of the security forces, the number of prisoners and people condemned because of terrorist actions linked to jihadist terrorism has grown considerably. And there's prisoners that little by little also are going to follow their sentences without giving up to what they had been defending, to their principles. At the same time also, the penitentiary means can be a good environment to capture vulnerable people that are susceptible of radicalization processes that will lead them towards actions, terrorist actions. And therefore, we've established certain joint action protocols with the penitentiary institutions, with an ongoing relationship with the Secretary General of Penitentiary Institutions in terms of detention, but also monitoring and action of people that have radicalized themselves in the post-penitentiary space. Finally, the involvement, obviously, or the participation in the initiatives that are implemented in the EU geared towards the elimination of illicit contents in internet, because they're contents that promote terrorism or that are a propaganda of the terrorist activities and violent actions. And therefore, all of these always being very attentive to a struggle against jihadist terrorism by the security forces. There's been different operations in 2019 and in 2022. Especially important are the ones against the capturing cells, indoctrination and training cells, and also there's been actions in order to dismantle financing structures and radicalization in prisons also. Last year, in 2019, we had a number of 58 arrests. 58 people were arrested because of terrorist crimes in Spain, and 10 more were investigated in third countries. Up to date, in 2020, in spite of the health crisis, we've continued having actions, and we've arrested up to now 32 individuals. The most recent one a few days ago only. In Spain, as a whole, is making a big effort, not only within our territory, but also abroad, specifically in Africa. The third African plan that was passed in March 2019 is a strategic plan that guides the relationship of Spain with the African continent under the premise of Spain and Africa, challenge and opportunity. It promotes getting closer to Africa based on shared interest and also based on a big consensus amongst the main stakeholders of Spain in the continent, specifically for the Sahel region. We in Spain have three main objectives. Number one, stabilizing the conflict areas and the action areas of the terrorist groups, including especially Mali, but also the Chad. Number two, advancing towards well-ordered and well-controlled migration in order to guarantee a regular type of migration. We're focusing our efforts and therefore we're getting good results. And finally, in terms of development, Spain wants to promote spaces of shared prosperity, democratic framework, and respect to human rights. As a proof of this commitment with the stabilization of the region, Spain has been present in Sahel for several years now in all of the missions, not only the military ones, but also civilian ones of the EU in the region and also in the MINUSMA of the United Nations. Specifically in Mali, Spain is the biggest contributor of soldiers in order to advise and inform the Mali army. The Civil Guard of Spain is leading the Sahel project of the EU in order to create units in the gendarmerie in Burkina Faso, Chad, Niger, and this is a project that has had a very good welcome by this country, by these countries, and that is giving fruit in things beyond only security. Spain was also actively involved together with France in several operations that we are still cooperating with the Barthane operation that has replaced the previous one. And the relevance of Sahel in Spain is proved also in the priority that we have in the international agenda of the Minister of the Domestic Affairs in order to go to countries of that region signing cooperation agreements in terms of security with countries of our environment. Finally, I'd like to finish. I intended to be brief. I'm sorry I took a bit too much time. So no, don't worry. I'd just like to finally underline very specific ideas that I'm going to use as a conclusion. Number one, we need to understand clearly that jihadist terrorism is still a serious threat for our country. It is a threat that has not translated itself sometimes in deadly attacks, thanks mostly to the permanent, constant work of the information and intelligence services, fortunately. But this threat is a relevant one, and precisely when we carry out police operations and when we get to understand it, we really realize that it is still present. We should not relax ourselves. It is a threat that requires to give the best of ourselves in order to offer to our citizens the best possible security. No country is exempt from risk of suffering from a terrorist attack. Neither are we. It is a shared threat. There is integral responses and well-coordinated responses, though, and that's what we're doing. We're working hand in hand together with our allied countries internationally. We're coordinating ourselves also at a national level with better resources, with new strategic designs that allow us to have an efficient prevention of the causes, but also an action which is very adamant against those that intend to destroy our democratic lifestyle. Finally, and this is really the end of my presentation, really, I hope that you really learn a lot from the wonderful panelists that you're going to be listening to today. I'm sure that it's going to be very interesting for all of you, for all of us, and I hope that you're going to be able to enjoy. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to all of you for listening to me.
Thank you very much for this very interesting bird's eye view of the current scenario. I don't think that I need to underscore that, of course, you can rely upon us. Anything we can do, we will do, within, of course, the scope of our possibilities. And let me also assure you that we wish you all possible success in this fight against this terrible threat. It's going to be long, it's going to be drawn out, and it's not going to be easy. So we have formally opened this 8th Elcano Forum on Global Terrorism. Thank you very much for being with us. And we now are going to ask Fernando Renares and Colonel Diaz-Alcalde. Gentlemen, please. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. We're back. This is the first of our two panels. We are going to be articulating herein the contents of this 8th Elcano Forum on Global Terrorism, this year's edition. And we're going to be focusing, as we know, on jihadism and terrorism in the Sahel. And the first of these two panels has as its aim that of helping us understand the origins of this increase, which has allowed for the configuration of the Sahel as one of the main jihadist scenarios in the world right now. So what are the conditions that have been favorable for this growing evolution? And we're also going to be researching what the ecosystem is of jihadist Salafism in the region. And we're going to be studying the mid to long-term trends and tendencies of jihadist rebel activities in the Sahel. Of course, bearing in mind what the efforts are that countries in the region are making and other countries not in the region, among them Spain, to mitigate this threat, because it is a threat, of course, for the development and prosperity of this region, and not only the region, but also other countries which are not that close to it. We have with us three excellent speakers. I think that they are really going to cast a strong light. So we have Jesus Diaz-Alcalde, who is head of the analysis unit at the Department of National Security here at the presidency of the government. And then we have also Catherine Zimmerman, who is an outstanding researcher and analyst, a fellow of the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute, which is a very well-known think tank in Washington, D.C. And our third speaker in this first panel is Matthew Nevins. He is an analyst specializing in terrorism, specifically in Africa, within the Bureau of Intelligence and Research with the Department of State in Washington, D.C. So without further ado, please, Jesus Diaz, when you will. Good afternoon. Fernando, thank you very much to you and to Carola. Thank you very much to the Real Instituto Elcano, of course, for allowing me to participate in this forum. I'm delighted to be back. Voy a permitirme dar las buenas tardes a nuestros colegas. Estoy encantado, la verdad, el de poder compartir este entorno con Catherine Zimmerman y Matthew Nevins. Muchísimas gracias a los dos. And thanks to all of your good selves for being with us this afternoon. Thanks to the persons who are following us, not here, but via remote. So let me not take up any more of your time, and let me just dive in and say what I've seen in my research and investigation of jihadism in the Sahel. And allow me first to actually set forth the parameters, because it's important, I think, to mention them. So first, let me underscore that we do not face an existential threat. It is a vital threat when we talk about jihadism. Wherever it may be in the world, wherever it may be growing, I think that we face this existential threat only if we believe that there's nothing we can do against it. And I don't think that this is the case. And I'm going to try to explain why as I take the floor briefly. I also would like to remind you that without underestimating the weight of ideology, which is so very pernicious for Muslims themselves, Jihadism, we never should underestimate that underlying this threat, there is something which is expanding, which is this ideology. Let me say it is Machiavellic, underlying jihadism, but we need to look for reasons. Often enough, we look for reasons in other more mundane elements. So we should understand that there's much more underlying this threat, much more than just an ideology. Yesterday, I read a report about democratization in Africa, and we see that for the first time it has receded over the past decade. So when we see these countries that we're looking at now, we realize that some factors, development, GDP, it's all shrinking in these countries. And when you see these scenarios, you can understand that the social frustration underlying life in these theaters is of a tremendous importance. I'm not going to say that it's a reason, but it is a motivation. Many persons, many Africans actually are recruited by jihadists. About 17 years ago, which is when I first actually visited Africa, I went to Eritrea, and after many other trips over these past 17 years, always in attempting to understand what it is that underlies these movements, I have come to understand that, in fact, just having a better school, for instance, or the possibility of acknowledgement, the possibility of knowing that you can have a decent life is very important for very many youth in these parts of the world. So over these 17 years that I have visited the ground, there's been a movement, and all of us now accept that it is a movement which has taken root in this part of the world, the Western Sahel and much more. Let's think about Mozambique, Somalia, the Congo, especially Mozambique. There was practically no jihadist presence in Mozambique, and now they have their own group which is close to Daesh. Now, I don't know whether you can see the slides. Because there's something interesting about this slide. First, there has been a growth, an increase over the past 8 years, and ostensibly so, because we could go back all the way to the 1980s when jihadism begins to appear. But as of 2012, how it has grown, it's expanded in geographical terms and in terms of numbers of groups, and unfortunately also in terms of lives lost, in terms of casualties and attacks. So now, as you can see, it is the part of the world where there is more jihadism and most quickly growing. It's true that as of 2015, we began to see a slight improvement in the terrorist activities themselves of the groups. So as of 2015, as I say, again, we begin to see how it shrinks. But as of 17, it's just been unstoppable. Interestingly enough, in 2017, this series of groups that are loyal to Al-Qaeda join forces under one umbrella, a franchise, which is the group which is known as J1000. But JNIM is not alone. There are other groups up there. Another group that is also loyal to the other franchise, and that is Daesh, the so-called Islamic State, ISGS. So right now, we see these two groups at loggerheads. They're trying to impose their presence, and they're affecting Niger and Burkina Faso. And what we have now is the most fearsome of all, which is joining up with Boko Haram from Nigeria, and there we would have a territorial space which is huge, and it would be literally plagued by this threat, as our Secretary of State rightly pointed out. And we've talked also about growing numbers of casualties and growing attacks. As of 17, where there were 2,700 lives lost, this is as a result of attacks, jihadist attacks. In 2019, it's 5,000. So that's times 2. The number of casualties, numbers of murders. And what could we say about the humanitarian crisis? Over 5 million displaced persons and refugees resulting from jihadism. I'd like to say that the observatory, the OIT, I would recommend that you explore this source of information. It's very interesting because not only are they very rigorous, but also they are close to the threat, they are close to the victims, and of course always keeping in mind how sensitive we need to be. But in October we see, I don't want to make a mistake, 25% more casualties in the Sahel with Niger this year. In Mali, and Mali had begun to see a reduction in the number of attacks, we see another upswing. And here, this coincides with the release of hundreds of jihadists, and I'm not going to say why these persons were released. And then the second issue, which is very important, is the huge international efforts undertaken within the Sahel, which is what I wanted to show you on screen. There's a French force, Barkhane, over 5,100 troops on ground fighting this very blurry threat, very complex, which is part of the population. And then we have a UN mission. For the first time, the UN, in a very difficult, very complex scenario, with the aim of protecting, because that is their mandate, they are peacekeepers for civilian populations. And this is the mission that has resulted in most casualties throughout the entire history of the United Nations. And then there's the European Union with 2 missions. We have the EU CAP and EUTM. In Mali, it's a skilling mission, and Spain, for us to understand what this actually represents for Spain, what is happening in the Sahel, we are going to multiply by 2 the number of Spanish troops in this mission. It is a training and skilling session for Mali armed forces, for the Malian armed forces. But then in the Sahel, we have another regional initiative which joins up the 5 Sahel countries, not only tackling jihadism, but also trying to incentivize development, attempts to incentivize development and governance in the entire region. And now, as I said to Fernando yesterday, we need to think about why jihadism continues to spread in this region. It's spreading despite the fact that we are really doing our utmost to bolster the forces. So let's think about this, and let's ask a question. If the problem stems from doing more, or does it stem from doing better? Doing more on site, or redefining rather, reinventing on a daily basis the kind of international support we should give in order to provide the best possible type of international support, because there's no doubt that international efforts, as you can see on screen, practically 20,000 persons, civilians and military, aiding the region, that's a huge effort. So, as I said, it's not about doing more, it's a question about can we do this better? Military operations, for the most part, are not going to provide a solution to this problem. A military solution will not be the solution we seek, but it is absolutely essential. In psychological terms, what any human being wants is feeling safe. If there's no security, nothing counts, nothing matters. It's not about thinking or determining whether the missions are or not necessary. They are. What we need to ponder upon is whether we need more. But it's not only about development. We do a lot of things looking for development. We can talk about coalitions for Sahel, the Alliance for the Sahel. Right now, Spain is at the head of the assembly, which focuses on development. But it's not about building roads or wells or schools. It's about creating prosperity for the population. And this is the second of the most important needs a human being has. And then there's freedom. Freedom. Freedom which people must enjoy and which can only be guaranteed by governments. It is absolutely essential to think about good governance on these different territories. And all of this, with all of the necessary international support, must be headed by governments, local governments, and regional organizations. Achieving all of this, security, prosperity, and freedom, for all of the many millions of citizens living in the Sahel who live so close to us, this calls for time and patience. I don't think that we need to hurtle along. What we need to know is determine whether we are on the right track. Let me now come to the end of my address, because I'm going to actually hark back to 2014. We were at Casa Arabe, and I shared a slide. I think that it had very much to do with what I believe is absolutely essential. And actually, I agree with Professor Zimmerman. I agree with her when she addresses the issue in her writing. And the Secretary of State has rightly pointed this out. Let me just make a reference to these 7 bullet points. On the one hand, yes, we need to continue to research the reasons that explain why what's happening is happening, but do it with the Africans. In other words, establish the common ground necessary to share our research results, and governments too, and universities as well. We see more and more fora coming up. I like to repeat myself when I say that, I don't know, it's like a mantra. If we don't know what the context is where threats crop up, for sure we're going to be making the wrong decision regarding the response. And then what we need, of course, to do is build local security, regional security forces that are truly efficient. And I underscore, they need to be scrupulously respected vis-à-vis human rights in the fight against terrorism. This is what we are striving to achieve in the European Union. Consolidate the rule of law. The main problem that this region faces is the lack of justice. There's no doubt, if you talk with anyone in that part of the world, they will say that what is most important is justice. And who is meting out justice? Well, not the judicial authorities. Development programs, eradication of poverty, yes, fine and good, but especially ensure that the local populations have the right to expect a decent livelihood. Fight to eradicate the funding of jihadism, which feeds off of all kinds of illicit activity, drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and of course, persons, the smuggling of persons, unfortunately. Unfortunately, the most tragic of all of these smuggling activities is the smuggling of people. And then, in an ongoing manner, assess the importance of international aid. So let's not stop and see the results. No, in an ongoing manner, assess those results. And let me now reach out to the media. The media should not only think about this region of the world when there are unfortunate attacks. I think all of us should become aware of the importance of this threat. And all of the media, there are very many who do this, but it needs to be more, and all, deal with this problem as it should be dealt, cover it as it should be covered. So Fernando, these are my bullet points for the afternoon. I think that if we think about each and every one of them, if we understand how difficult they are to achieve, I think that then we will be able to see the end of this terrible fact in the Sahel, from within the Sahel, threatening all of us, and more especially Europe and Spain. Thank you all very much. Good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Jesus, for your excellent presentation. It was really clarifying. It was very, very important. You've also mentioned the very necessary frameworks that need to frame the efforts of struggle against jihadist terrorism in Sahel. And no doubt, I'm sure that Catherine Zimmerman is going to add value to the contents of this panel, and probably she's already listening to me. Are you, Catherine, from Washington? Hi, Catherine. Hi, good afternoon, Catherine.
Good to be here.
Good morning in Washington. It is a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you very much, Catherine.
thank you, and I just want to thank you and
Muchas
the rest
gracias.
of
De
the
hecho, quería
that
darles
made this
las
possible.
gracias a todos.
It's such a pleasure to be joining you. I wish under different circumstances I could be joining
Con
actually in
vosotros,
Madrid
ojalá
in
en otras
December.
circunstancias hubiera podido estar con vosotros físicamente en Madrid. Espero que algún día pueda ser.
I want to start today by
Hoy quiero empezar
looking at
revisando
the US framing of the problem set in
el
Sahel. I think that
marco desde el punto de vista de
as we
los
look at
Estados
how the issues have
Unidos
developed,
en
understanding how
el
the US
Sahel
has
y
engaged
cómo
in
se ha
will help us
evolucionado.
understand why we face some of the challenges today. And I want to keep it really short, but as we just heard, there is a significant threat coming out of the Sahel region, what I call the Salafi jihadi threat. It's one that's not going away anytime soon. We have a variety of partners, both local and international, working to combat the threat. But as we all know very well, it's not just on the security side, but also on the terrorism side. The kind of evolution of that threat is significant. We now have members of JNIM who, when they're captured, they identify themselves as being part of Al-Qaeda. So whereas when I first started looking at this region, the Al-Qaeda presence was in the shadows, it was not really recognized. We now see foot soldiers talking about being part of Al-Qaeda and tying themselves up to that global jihad movement. And finally, as we look at it, that threat, it's resilient. We've seen how it's adapted, particularly over the past 8 years. It's become incredibly resourceful, and it does have strategic aims. So, as I walk you through, I'm going to keep my remarks short, but really look at the U.S. framing of the region and how the U.S. has engaged in counterterrorism, and then get into what I call the Salafi jihadi ecosystem. So first off, what is the U.S. doing, and how does that fit into our global perspective? The U.S. is in the Sahel and engaging primarily because of security reasons. When we're looking at American interests, they really do kind of hinge on that counterterrorism nexus that we now see in the Sahel region. The U.S. actively seeks to deny sanctuary to groups like JNIM, like the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, ISGS, worldwide. And we are looking to enable our partners globally to step up their efforts against these groups. And so we support both local and international partners engaged in these, and then of course conduct our own counterterrorism operations when we assess there to be an imminent threat to the United States itself. The US seeks to be broadly to be an enabler and use our special forces in that way and some of the unique capabilities that we can bring to the counterterrorism fight. The challenge, I think, that the Americans and our international partners, and we heard some of these remarks earlier, is in reducing some of the drivers that enable these groups to recruit. So the conditions, when you look at these challenges in the counterterrorism fight, the counterterrorism part is actually quite easy when we're thinking about security. The more complicated dynamics are the local conditions and the political ground factors that enabled insurgencies to continue and have enabled groups like JNIM to expand. I'm happy to go into that a little bit more in question and answer. That's not going to be the focus of my remarks today. When we're looking at what the US is doing, specifically in the Sahel, we operate, frankly, on a prioritized resources. The US is operating globally, and if you stack the threats to the United States from the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda against each other, the Sahel region starts to fall farther to the bottom of that pile, and that dictates the type of resources that we're putting into the region. So, of course, we have the active war in Afghanistan. We are still operating in Iraq and Syria. We have significant engagement inside of Somalia and Yemen, and then are working very, very closely with our French partners in the Sahel and trying to enable them to do more than they would on their own. The kind of prioritization of this region And the fact that the groups in the Sahel have not posed an imminent threat to the United States has meant that the French continue to take lead, and also that it's been a supporting effort for the US and specifically for US Africa Command, AFRICOM, excuse me, working on the African continent. The United States tends to divide up, and I think that this is right when thinking about resources, but wrong when thinking about strategy, the local and the global threats. So the fact that we have not seen global aspirations coming out of the Sahel has meant that the United States is looking to work by, with, and through our partners in the region to counter JNIM and other groups. It also explains fundamentally why we've missed the cutting off the head of this group when it started to metastasize, when it started to expand inside of Mali initially in 2012. And that's where I'd like to focus the bulk of my remarks, but looking at the ecosystem as it evolved and kind of why it actually is so complicated today for us to counter. So, when we're looking at the threat from the Sahel region, you can go back 20 years ago, and at that time, Al-Qaeda was not active in the Sahel region. It wasn't really active in North Africa. Coming up forward, we saw the development of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM. AQIM was a threat to the Algerian state, certainly, and it was behind a series of attacks inside of Europe. And so, the perspective, the American versus the European perspective on AQIM is different. But by and large, by the end of the 2000s, by 2007, 8, 9, 10, AQIM was largely dismissed as a smuggling and criminal racketeering organization. It was conducting kidnappings for ransom in the Sahel. And the Algerian military and security forces were able to keep the terror threat in check inside of Algeria itself. The problem was that at this time, and we can look back with hindsight and see how some of the Al-Qaeda members were actively engaging in embedding themselves in the Azawad region in Mali and trying to embed themselves into the society. So, intermarriage into some of the local groups and communities that, 10 years down the line have served Al-Qaeda very, very well in terms of giving Al-Qaeda a local community base. And this is a deliberate expansion ploy by Al-Qaeda, and we've seen it incredibly successful. So, I describe that a little bit as capturing kingpins within the terrain. The idea here is that these key individuals like Iyad Ali, who in the mid-2000s was simply a hostage negotiator, but he is now a full-blown member of Al-Qaeda. He supports the ideology. He has local legitimacy within his community. He has access to resources through his role as a smuggler, and he is the vector by which Al-Qaeda has really been able to enmesh itself inside of the Sahel region. If we want to spin through how the ecosystem developed, it started in that Azawad region that was cultivated in the 2000s and spread from there. You can look at the Tuareg rebellion as what set off all of this, but it was merely the rebellion that created conditions that were conducive to the expansion of Al-Qaeda. We saw the rise of Iyad Ali's group, Ansar ad-Din, which pulled on his own constituents, and then the splintering of AQIM in 2011 and 2012 into a group known then as Mujao, and then in 2012, the group led by Mokhtar Belmokhtar, which is known as Malathamoon, and later Amwakum Bidam, so the signers with blood. And those two Al-Qaeda splinters remerged in August of 2013 to form Al-Murabitun, which really became the Al-Qaeda group active in the Sahel region, affiliated with AQIM and pursuing Al-Qaeda's objectives. The interesting thing about Al-Murabitun is how it engaged with Ansar ad-Din. It was enabling Ansar ad-Din from behind the scenes in kind of allowing the local group to have lead on the fight. And did the same thing when we started to see a new group emerge in central Mali known as the Messina Liberation Front in January of 2015. So we saw the fight move from northern Mali down into central Mali. And then it kind of expanded really into Niger and Burkina Faso. By the end of 2016, we had a new group, Ansar al-Islam, that was established in northern Burkina Faso. And in between, then we had the splinter of the Islamic State establishing itself in the Niger area. Drawing back from this, you can kind of trace out these groups, and what I just described to you as a very divided movement. But when you understand how the divisions occurred, you can understand that actually many of these fractures and splits enabled the Salafi jihadi groups to better integrate into local communities and to advocate for that community to put on a local face outside of that global jihad brand. So again, back to the US framing, right, this global and local question, Al-Qaeda has really played with it closely, particularly in Mali and in the Sahel region. And the kind of explicit and intentional identification of future leaders. So the leader of Messina Liberation Front, the group that came up in central Mali in 2015, he actually fought in northern Mali with Ansar ad-Din in 2012, 2013 time period. So he received training, he was vetted, he built the personal relationship that then enabled him to receive the funding to start up his group. And the leader of Ansar al-Islam, the Burkinabe faction, same thing. He actually was working with Messina Liberation Front in 2015. So again, was vetted, developed the relationships, and you could see kind of the personal identity politics moving through, both in terms of the identity groups that these various splinters tapped into, and the kind of leadership identities and the various attributes that the new leaders would carry with them into a new targeted community. The overall fracturing of the movement and the development of this ecosystem didn't weaken the Salafi jihadi movement inside of the Sahel, but rather it strengthened it by enabling it to tap into it and to play these community politics and defend various communities. When JNIM reunited in March of 2017, it did so bringing together these disparate communities that previously had nothing to do with each other into kind of this broader composite of umbrella group under JNIM, so kind of uniting them under that Islamist umbrella. Kind of the last bit that I want to touch on, and I want to leave plenty of time for question and answer here, is the emergence of the Islamic State. So I mentioned that it broke off in 2015. The group was led by this individual called Sahrawi, and Sahrawi, he was initially not recognized by the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. It took over a year for that Islamic State branch to gain kind of formal global recognition, partially because it wasn't actually conducting attacks, and partially because the Islamic State had recognized another group in Western Africa already. But from the course of its founding until actually the spring, the Islamic State and the Al-Qaeda groups inside of the Sahel deconflicted and in some cases actually coordinated. So the leaders of these organizations and many of the key figures have shared histories, and those pieces of shared experience enabled them to coordinate their activities on the ground, and that led to the overall strengthening of the group. In the spring and forward, we saw direct competition between the Islamic State and JNIM in kind of the Niger-Malian border area. And that, I think, is less to do with the ideological differences and more to do with two now very strong groups coming into contact and competing with resources on the ground. They're both organizations. They both need the things that all organizations need: money, fighters, resources, space. And as they are growing, they're starting to touch each other. So while the infighting is, of course, something that we should watch carefully, it's not something that's going to fundamentally weaken these groups over the long term, because when you look at what they're both fighting for, they're sharing the same objectives. And so, my big concern looking forward is how these groups have managed to continue to expand even under the current counterterrorism pressure. The French are leading Operation Barkhane. We just heard, right, 5,100 French soldiers there. They started up a Takuba task force, which is going to pull on additional European special forces to work alongside Malian forces on the ground countering these organizations. But the assessment, at least from the American standpoint, is very dire. For all of the counterterrorism efforts in the region, and that's particularly on the military and security front, we have been unable to contain the threat from these groups, and they're now pushing against the littoral states of the Gulf of Guinea and expanding outward. So I just want to leave it there, and I'm certainly, there's very much to talk about in the question and answer section. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Catherine Zimmerman for this very interesting contribution to our panel session. And especially thank you for allowing us to go back in time and understand the encroachment of jihadism in the region. We're looking to that movement towards the south of jihadists from Algeria, and that was, of course, thanks to their close involvement with local populations. That is what made it possible to have that event in 2012 in northern Mali. And thank you also for your comments regarding the international and French responses to all of these events. Thank you very much for your contributions. Very interesting. And I think that now probably from Washington also is Matthew Nevins. Matt, are you there?
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for the
Buenas
introduction,
tardes.
I'm honored to have been invited to speak today.
Sí, estoy encantado, además de hablar. Efectivamente, soy analista.
I focus on terrorism across the Maghreb and in West Africa. I should note that today my comments represent my own views and shouldn't be construed as the official views of the U.S. government. So following up on those two great presentations, thanks to Jesus and Katie for your comments. I think they helpfully set the stage. And so I'll go forward with my remarks on what I see as key trends across the region and things to watch for going forward. First, some context, and Jesus already hit on this point, but I'd like to underscore that the first 9 months of 2020 were more deadly in terms of conflict fatalities in the Sahel than any other whole year period since 2012. There have been three facets of this trend I'd like to highlight. First, that we're seeing an increasingly broad regionalization of the crisis. Second, that while the geographic distribution widens, we consistently see the bar raised on the pace of operational activity. And third, that some important on-the-ground dynamics are changing, highlighted, as Katie described, by the hostilities between JNIM and ISGS. So on the first point regarding the regionalization of the crisis, a few examples to underscore that point. The share of attacks by JNIM, ISGS, and Ansar al-Islam that took place in Burkina Faso rose from 20% in 2017 to 55% in 2019, which just underscores the increasing centrality of Burkina Faso to the insurgency. This year, conflict events in Mali are outpacing Burkina Faso, probably because of hostilities between JNIM and ISGS. But from 2017 to 2019, Mali's southern provinces of Segu, Kolokoro, and Sikasso averaged 34 attacks per year, and through 10 months this year, there have been 61. And now terrorist groups threaten the territorial integrity of littoral West Africa, the coastal states, as demonstrated by the Kafolo attack in June. In June, JNIM, almost certainly elements of its Katiba Messina or Messina Liberation Front, conducted a reprisal attack against Ivoirian troops in Kafolo, Cote d'Ivoire, in response to a joint operation the Ivoirians had carried out with Burkina Faso, targeting terrorist elements in northern Cote d'Ivoire. That attack was the first in the country since 2016. But perhaps more importantly, it underscored that despite the reported success of the joint operation, JNIM's presence was only very temporarily disturbed. In my opinion, the lack of attacks before or after Kafolo are not indicative of a lack of capacity, but rather a decision on the part of JNIM to exercise strategic patience while establishing a foothold. It's worth distinguishing the attack that took place at Grand Bassam in 2016 from the one that took place in June. In the former case, it was an external terrorist attack conducted by a Mali-based terrorist group against a civilian target. In 2020, the attack was conducted by a local group against a military target. So the growing presence along the northern borders, or even in the northern parts of Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Togo, and Benin, is that by opening new fronts, JNIM gains access to new sources of manpower and funding, creates new safe havens to avoid CT pressure, and facilitates logistics for operations in Burkina Faso, or as happened at Grand Bassam, for attacks in the littoral capitals. The north-south expansion of JNIM continues to overstretch regional CT forces and complicates the mission of the Sahel G5. And the second point is that while the geographic distribution widens, we see the bar raised on the pace of operational activity. Attacks in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso's tri-state area nearly doubled each year from 2017 to 2019. And in 2020, through 10 months, attacks are on pace to be up by about another 30 or 40% again this year. Terrorist groups now carry out a faster pace of attacks across a wider regional area, which underscores the depth of their entrenchment in some areas, but also their ability to open new fronts, support them logistically, and build new inroads and connections with local populations, even where they were absent only a few years ago. Nowhere is that trend more evident than in Burkina Faso, where there were 85 attacks in 2017 and 519 last year. That point somewhat speaks for itself. We're seeing new thresholds of violence reached with unfortunate consistency, which leads to the third point, which is that some on-the-ground dynamics are changing, highlighted not only by the conflict between JNIM and ISGS, but also by the increasing attention given to the area by ISIS-Core and Al-Qaeda. Hostilities between JNIM and ISGS since early 2020 have diverted some attention away from high-profile attacks on regional forces, but that competition for jihadist preeminence in the area risks settling into a new status quo that encourages outbidding by either group, probably leading to more violence in the long run. It's worth highlighting that the status quo ante, some degree of tolerance and limited tactical cooperation, like Katie described, is made significantly more difficult going forward by the ongoing propaganda tit for tat. Recently, ISGS's Emir Adnan Abu Walid al-Sarawi conducted an interview with Al-Naba, the ISIS weekly newsletter, emphasized JNIM's defections to ISIS and accused JNIM of starting the war because it couldn't bear the continuous bleeding from its factions. Earlier this year, ISIS's propaganda, also in its Naba weekly newsletter, accused JNIM of apostasy for its ongoing negotiations with the Malian government and for its lack of application of Sharia in the areas that it controls. And for its part, JNIM released materials that refuted some of those charges, that it was ideologically weak and wasn't implementing Sharia. JNIM's recent prisoner swap had some broader implications in this regard. That it could secure the release of 200 or so people sends a message not only to its members, but to the population more broadly. JNIM can get things done, that it has the upper hand still in Mali, and that it can free its own people from custody, but also probably a broader range of non-jihadist detainees who had probably been wrapped up in security sweeps, which helps it foster goodwill with other key regional power brokers. So while terrorist activity expands north-south as previously described, there's a simultaneous risk of east-west growth that risks linking jihadist epicenters in the Sahel and in the Lake Chad Basin, and Jesus touched on this very helpfully. Networking those epicenters would facilitate greater cooperation between groups, including shared logistics, manpower, and other resources. Sahel-based ISGS and Northeast Nigeria-based ISIS West Africa are operationally distinct, but in its most recent report, the UN Security Council's 1267 monitoring team described an already ongoing logistical relationship between those two groups. The attack on August 9th in the Kouré Giraffe Reserve that killed 8 people, including 6 humanitarian workers and a local driver and guide, took place about 60 miles east of Niamey in Niger, the first attack of its kind by ISIS in that area. And then subsequently, the early November kidnapping of a US citizen along the Niger-Nigeria border was not conducted by a jihadist group, but it's still a reminder of the insecurity in the area and the risk that if exploited by jihadist groups, it could lead to the opening of a new operational front that would only further strain regional CT actors. So where do we go from here? I think it's worth watching the situation in northwest Nigeria, particularly the reemergence of Ansaru and its Al-Qaeda connections and the very real threat that jihadist expansion in that area helps construct a land bridge that links the Lake Chad Basin and Sahel theaters. For ISGS, we've seen a big shift in its efficacy since it started getting more attention from ISIS-Core in 2019, conducted the most lethal attacks in its history in late 2019 and early 2020, and increasingly found itself in a position to challenge JNIM's hegemony. Now that JNIM's pushed back on that expansion, I think it's going to be interesting to see where it goes and whether the attack in Kure portends a more aggressive approach towards soft targets outside its normal operating areas in Liptako Gorma. And finally, for JNIM, I think the recent negotiations are a big victory. Kidnapping for ransom slowed in recent years, but it's sort of a proof of concept that the recent exchange is a reminder of how impactful negotiations can be. Not only can JNIM use that to curry favor with other northern Malian constituents, but it's also one more salvo in the war against ISIS-GS. And it also opened or kept open channels that could be used for future negotiations, whether for hostages or anything else. So I'll pause there and turn it back over to Fernando, and happy to take any questions as they come up.
Muchas gracias, Matt, por tu también excelente aportación al panel.
Excellent contribution to today's panel. First, 3 questions, actually, one for each one of the panelists. Actually, there's been many questions that we got via email, because there's attendants who are listening to us via internet. The first question is asked by, or actually for you, Jesus Diaz Alcalde. It's as follows. I would like to know, Jesus, your view about whether the European Union, or actually Spain, should be involved to a bigger extent in some of the pillars of the coalition for Sahel. Specifically, why not on one? And I guess he's referring to Spain. And also related to that, not only contributing to the training of the armed forces in Mali, would it be also possible maybe for Spain to do something else on the ground? That's a question for Jesus Diaz Alcalde. Now I have another question for Catherine. Kathy, the question for you has to do with, let me read it and understand it, with the incursion in the political scene by the jihadists in Mali. And somebody else asked about whether it is possible or whether it is part of the strategy of jihadists in Sahel, and specifically of jihadists who are aligned with Al-Qaeda. Is it possible to repeat the experience of having a jihadist domain, such as the one that was installed on northern Mali in 2012? Matthew, a question for you also. They want to know your opinion about the liberation of jihadist prisoners who were imprisoned in countries in the Sahel, and to what extent is this related to the initiatives that suggest that maybe negotiations should be developed between the governments of countries of that region and some jihadist entities, actually. Why don't we first give the floor to Jesus so that he answers his question. Thank you very much for your question, and that allows me to speak a bit more about Spain specifically. Spain, the focus of attention, because that has been decided, so is the European Union. That's the framework of action, and also the United Nations. Spain is a firm defendant of the fact that we need to help the local national governments promote regional organizations, so that actually what the African Union promotes is that they should solve the African problems in a way that there's African solutions for African problems. So Spain is a very, very clear member state of the United Nations and firm in the contribution to the mission, be it Mali or any others, to such an extent that we in Spain contribute more than 27% of the forces of the European Union in all of its missions. Actually, we're even going to increase our contribution to UTM Mali in order to train the forces in Mali to help the security sector in Mali. Also, we're going to increase, so that we're going to deploy more than 50% of the forces of UTM Mali, which will be increasing this year, very soon actually. Now, you're suggesting whether we could do more in order to help the first pillar, which is security of the security framework. Well, yes, this is the mission of Spain. As I said, our mission is to train in terms of values and human rights respect, to train the Mali forces. And we're doing a bit more than, the question is, are we doing anything else apart than contributing with the armed forces? Oh yes, we are. We are helping develop that area. Actually, the Alliance for the Sahel, that is especially focused on development, is presently chaired. The assembly of that alliance is chaired by Spain. Actually, the permanent chairman is Spanish. So as I've said during my talk, yes, we can all do more, and we need to be more present on the ground, obviously. Because if this is a global threat, and that is the case, we should not only use the European Union, but also we should go to other places to see how many should be there. Those of us who are there, we're doing the work. In this case, Spain is showing a clear commitment on the ground. Yes, we need to do more, but I insist, we always need to have more people on the ground from other countries. So that's my way to answer the question. Thank you very much, Jesus. But before I give you, Catherine, the floor, I'm going to ask once again the question to Matt, because it seems that he was not capable of understanding it correctly. Matt, the question of the people who are following us via streaming are asking, how can you explain that governments in the region release hundreds of jihadists who were in prison? Is this related maybe to the initiatives that suggest that there should have negotiations between the governments of that area and some jihadist entities? Is there any relationship between that release or discharge of prisoners? First, Catherine, please.
Great, thank you. So it seems like the question was looking a little bit twofold. One is, what about this idea of including some of the members of the Salafi jihadists in Mali politics, right? So one of the ideas about reducing the threat from GSIM in particular is incorporating some of the leadership into the Malian political scene and negotiating a settlement. And then the second part is actually looking at the political objectives of GSIM. So what are they trying to do, and are they going to bring back the emirate that was declared in Timbuktu? I think that they're interrelated. And to kind of the idea of negotiating a settlement, this is where really getting the nuance and expert understanding of why certain individuals are part of JNIM and how committed they are ideologically to what JNIM, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State stand for is so important. The majority of the members of these groups are not ideologically sold there. So Salafi jihadism is such a fringe movement that we can readily say that most of the foot soldiers and certainly some of the leadership are fighting for their own personal objectives and reasons. And JNIM, its objectives align with their short term. So the part of any strategy should be to peel away those individuals that are reconcilable, that can be brought into the political spectrum. I will say that, but there's a big caveat, and that is to say that there are leaders within JNIM that are ideologically tied to this idea of global jihad and the primacy of Islam and their own interpretation of Islam in defining how people live. And those individuals are ones that we should not be incorporating into the government, and we should readily be identifying them really as at least adversaries, but most likely enemies in terms of how we engage with them. So, you can certainly reduce JNIM's strength by negotiating and creating conditions to pull away certain factions, but it shouldn't be seen as the final solution, if you will. There is going to still be a terrorist backbone, if you will, that does need to be countered. And it's that terrorist backbone that's driving the full movement. So that's the backbone that's actually looking to establish this emirate long term. Are they looking to do it right now? No, and this goes back to something that Matt said about strategic patience. JNIM, Al-Qaeda in particular, have really learned what raises the attention a little bit under Sharia. So the legacy influence of these groups remain in the areas where they're active, and they're able to shape how Muslims live long term. So they are ordering society, but they're not doing it and calling attention to it the way that they did in 2012 because of lessons learned. That doesn't mean that they don't intend to do that at some point, but if you actually take a step back and look at their strategy writ large, they're seeking to gain enough strength over the long term in order to be able to declare it once and for all. And so to that, they look to the lesson of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, which did that on a massive scale and has now been removed physically from the terrain. So, I think that as we're looking at this long term, that kind of ideological skeleton is driving toward declaring an emirate, but only when it believes that it will be able to do so without significant risk to its survival. Thank you.
Kathy. Matt?
Por favor. With regards the excarceration of jihadists, the release of jihadists, and negotiations among governments in the area and jihadist organizations?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. It's an important one, and it's pretty similar to some of the comments that Katie just made. In terms of what extent the jihadist prisoners and their release relate to initiatives that suggest maybe negotiation should be developed between these countries and jihadists. The topic of negotiations is complicated by, as Katie described, the fact that JNIM remains an affiliate of Al-Qaeda. And so the prisoner swap is evidence that, these channels for talks can be opened through intermediaries, at least in some cases. Mutually acceptable settlements are possible, but I think it's worth separating these settlements with relatively limited aims, releasing prisoners from both sides, from a broader conversation on settling Mali's conflict, for which there is probably going to necessarily be some sort of discussion. It's not a purely military solution, but for which, again, as Katie described, maybe there's a path to peel away reconcilable factions or members of these groups that aren't necessarily ideological from top to bottom, but there does remain a very committed core to these groups in the leadership that remains loyal to Al-Qaeda, for which negotiations would be particularly difficult. I think they do a good job sometimes of hiding their hand in the Sahel, at least insofar as exercising patience and avoiding activities that would, draw the ire of the international community. You've seen, a reduction in the number of major external attacks. You've seen, on the part of JNIM, a reduction in attacks in capital cities. The Grand Bassam attack in 2016, for example, is something that you haven't seen JNIM do in a few years, I think in part because that makes it really hard to look at them as an organization that can be negotiated with. It doesn't mean that their aims have changed or that that's not still, one of the cards they can play, but they may just judge right now that that's not in their interest. I don't think it's at all a lack of capacity on their part. I think they could very much organize these attacks if they chose to. So I think the lack of attacks like these are evidence of a choice on their part. And I think that choice plays into what they see as like a more important political narrative, which is that, they are willing to enter into negotiations really with the upper hand in this case. And a negotiated settlement, I don't think is the end. It's more a means to an end, which, ultimately in their view, probably over the very long term involves flying the black flag. But I think there's widespread recognition that that's not coming in the near future on the part of JNIM. Obviously, ISIS has different aims and doesn't necessarily exercise the same type of patience that Al-Qaeda or JNIM do. So I guess that's sort of a winding way of saying that I think the negotiations that were successful for the hostages are just one small component of what would be sort of a much broader and more complicated effort to enter into broader negotiations to settle Mali's conflict, just the region's conflict in general. So, I mean, it's evidence that those channels can be opened, that they can reach out. But by and large, the jihadists in this case have the position of strength in negotiations. And so I think that the likelihood of a negotiated settlement, at least at present, would be pretty low.
Yes, Matthew.
We're running late. We're running 15 minutes late vis-a-vis our program. So I think that the time has come now to put an end to this first panel. And we continue to address the second panel. Panel 2 bears the title Jihadist Terrorism in and from the Sahel. What are the implications for Spain? But Matthew, let me first say thank you. Thank you very much for your contributions. And thank you also to Kathy, and Jesus, of course. It was very generous of all three of you to share your thoughts and knowledge very succinctly, but just as happens in other instances, very enlightening. Very enlightening and very enriching for all of us. So thank you so very much to the three of you. The panel has benefited from your presence. So let me now ask Carola Garcia Calvo to step in and be our moderator for the second panel. Thank you very much.
Sí, buenas tardes. Sí. Hola, ¿qué tal? Sí. Bien, no me quería alejar mucho del ordenador porque el micrófono está incorporado y entonces era por no perder calidad del audio, pero no sé si así se oye bien. Pues entonces, estupendo. Sí, yo sin problema.
¿Me oyes? ¿Me oyes? Bueno, perfecto. Muy bien. Sí. Sí. Pues más alejado. Vamos a ver. Más bajo. Sí. Lo único que quería que saliera lo decía porque si no van a decir que tal y que cual. Es que el problema es que no se ve. Bueno, puedo poner, espera, podemos hacer una cosa. Vamos a intentar hacer una cosa. Si movemos la mesa hacia adelante, a ver, vamos a mover esta mesa hacia adelante. Vamos a ver, ahora moviendo la mesa hacia adelante un poco, vamos a ver, ponemos esto un poquito más atrás, a ver, esto quizás un poquito más allá, esto más o menos así, y ahí queda. ¿Quedaría bien ahí? Muy bien, perfecto. Venga, pues pongo en silencio el micro.
Hello all, good afternoon, good morning, depending on what part of the world you're in. This is, as we know, the 8th Elcano Forum on Global Terrorism, and I'm delighted to chair this second panel. We have heard about the broader framework. We've seen an analysis of current events in the Sahel. This was panel number 1, evolution of the jihadist insurgency across the Sahel. What we're going to do now is analyze what the implications are specifically for Spain. Now, in order to do our job, we have in this panel 3 experts. They are analysts and specialists in the region. we're going to benefit not only from a theoretical but also from a practical assessment. We are going to go from the broader aspects, and thus we will be analyzing the propaganda that is disseminated by the jihadists in the Sahel, including references made to Spain. And this is going to be carried out by Manuel Torres, professor of political science at the University Pablo de Olavide in Seville. He is in Seville. He will be joining us virtually. And furthermore, Professor Torres is a member of the Scientific Council of the Elcano Royal Institute. We will then hear about the threat of jihadist terrorism and what it actually implies for Spanish interests and citizens in this part of the world. In the Sahel, of course. This address will also be live, on site. This is the part of the world that Jesus Diaz referred to. As I say, this is going to be thanks to the commander of the Civil Guard and adjunct coordinator of European project GARC Sahel in Mali. This is Gerardo Otero. We've heard our Secretary of State refer to this project. As I say, Commander Otero will be joining us from Mali, and we will finally address the issue of the assessment of the potential of jihadist attacks within our borders in Spain, which stem from the Sahel. And our speaker will be Manuel Rodriguez, who is with us physically this afternoon in real life, Principal Superintendent and Head of the Central Unit for External Information, Department General for Information, National Police. Thank you very much for having come to the Institute to join us. Thank you. So this is what we are going to be addressing for the upcoming hour, more or less. We do not want to further extend this introductory session, so Manuel Torres, good afternoon. I hope that you can now take a look at the first issue that we will be addressing in this second panel. You have the floor, sir. Professor Torres, hello, good afternoon. Manuel, can you hear us?
Hola, buenas tardes.
Yes, good afternoon. Manuel, thank you so very much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Thank you for sharing your analysis and research on the issue that we are dealing with this afternoon. Without further ado, please, you have 10 minutes.
Pues muchísimas gracias, Carola. Y no quiero comenzar sin reiterar mi agradecimiento tanto a ti como al profesor Reinares por darme la oportunidad en otra edición de participar en este foro, que sin duda es el evento más importante sobre terrorismo yihadista que se celebra anualmente en nuestro país. Es un privilegio y lamento mucho no poder estar presente
I'm happy to be with you virtually. I would much prefer to be with you physically to meet all these
Voy a dedicar mi tiempo a plantear algunas claves que nos pueden resultar de utilidad a la hora de responder al objetivo de esta mesa redonda. Para no solaparme con el resto de ponentes, me dedicaré en exclusiva a hablar de la dimensión propagandística de este terrorismo, de la cual se pueden extraer algunas ideas interesantes para entender las implicaciones que para España tienen las acciones de estos grupos.
Of the actions carried out by these groups. In general systems, the ecosystem of propaganda in the Sahel can be divided into two spheres, the global and the local. The first one includes propaganda targeting the international community. And basically, this is press releases that accept responsibility for attacks, statements by leaders repeating the jihadist song of conspiracy to subject Islam and its people, and the legitimacy of violence exerted or visited upon its enemies. They are usually in Arabic, French, and English in order to reach out target audiences. However, in local terms, what we see is propaganda designed for local consumption, to be consumed by local citizens. So that is drafted in local languages, and they are released via closed groups, basically WhatsApps. And also leaflets that are handed physically into the hands of local populations. Language barriers and the limited access to these documents explains why we're not really sure what the effects are of this propaganda. So this is warning number one. Our interpretation of the threat of these groups, their internal dynamics, their vested interests, well, we don't have all of that information. So it is very possible that we are missing out on some key aspects that would allow us to understand how this threat would actually flesh out. And more especially, everything that has to do with internal strife, alliances, and local implication and involvement. Secondly, we should also bear in mind that in terms of communications, there is asymmetry between the two main elements of the agents in the Sahel. The establishment of the group that defends Islam and Muslims, GSIM, was achieved simultaneously to that of Al-Halaka. Al-Halaka would focus on centralizing the propaganda. This arm of propaganda had the full backing of the Al-Qaeda publicity machine, Alamna Ludnaya, which transferred to jihad in the Sahel the expertise that these groups had accumulated over 20 years' work and time, but also fully aware of how to best address these issues. And then the ISGS, back in 2015, was set up precariously. ISGS needed 1.5 years to formalize its adhesion to the group, and not even then did the group from the Sahel benefit from the support of the propaganda arm. This group depended on its own means to advertise its activities. Very basic, very rudimentary, and not connected to the jihadist structure that was up and running on the web. And some of the main products were seen in Mauritania and in some international media alike. ISGS had difficulties in going beyond the limits of the local sphere. In 2019, this was possible thanks to ISIS, with the help of provincial authorities. It could not benefit from the golden age of the propaganda arm, which was degraded after the tumbling down of the project in Syria, among others. But they became more and more aggressive, defending their right to their space in the face of hegemony, which had been, until that moment, benefited the GSIM. This eventually resulted in an open war, as made visible by the attacks that are carried out by means of their propaganda factions. It's important to understand that this is important for both organizations, and we must not reach hurried conclusions. The acronym GSIM is one thing, but the ISGS perhaps has not specifically targeted Spain. Does this mean that this is less of a threat than that of its competitor? Well, the answer is that doubtless no. In Western Africa, the Islamic State shares the same worldview as GSIM with regards to who the enemies are and how to actually deal with them. It hasn't made it manifest, but it is actually because it cannot do so. They cannot communicate, and when they do, they don't do a good job. Things might change, though, and very quickly, should this option be fostered, and we see that in headquarters. The Islamic State became the jihadist agent that has most frequently referred to Spain in its reports. The aim is, of course, to ensure hyperactivity in communications terms in the face of dozens of products that are disseminated every week, multiplied the probabilities of Spain being its object. Other countries had less of a profile, and Al-Qaeda did not wish to focus their attempts there. So we should not be surprised this apparent lack of interest in Spain be rapidly turned upside down. Something that can happen very subtly, especially if we remember how important the individual factor are in the activities carried out by these groups. So it's important to think about propaganda carried out, which implies not only being skillful, but also ensuring that those obsessions at the end of the day permeate the official discourse. So remember that the first time that ACME referred to Spain in one of its videos, this was back in September 2015. At that point in time was not the beginning of a renewed interest of the group to reach out to a Spanish-speaking audience. No, it's simpler to understand that there was availability at that point in time of a rebel member who spoke Spanish and could speak out in Spanish. This was actually a deserter, Zakaria Zaid Mohammed, on camera, reached out to his brethren to participate in the jihad, but specifically targeted his message to Muslims in Melilla. Why? Because this was a city he knew full well, because this is the city where he had lived for most of his life. Now, as you can imagine, the reasons that explain making a reference or not to that kind of a country and the contents, well, this responds to factors that are really whimsical, such as recruitment and sharing of tasks. So we need to be focused and understand that the importance of Spain in this discourse may go from 0 to 100 at breakneck speed. Actually, jihadist groups active in the Sahel understand that the differentiating element of Spain vis-a-vis other Western countries that currently obsess them, that's France and the United States of America, it is their presence has not much to do with their actual degree of involvement in the region. Jihadists in the Maghreb and in the Sahel think of themselves as the heirs of the Arab conquerors who brought Islam to the Iberian Peninsula nearly 1,000 years ago. It's not just rhetoric, it's much more than that. It's not only what they call their actions and attacks, it's actually a way of allowing us to understand where they're headed. So when ACME decides to establish its Department of Propaganda, they call it Al-Andalus Media, and I quote, to remind all Muslims in general and the populations in the Islamic Maghreb that they are closely linked to Al-Andalus, and they are mandated on behalf of Allah to go to Al-Andalus until every inch be recovered. Islam from the Sahel also believes that they are fighting this war between Islam and its secular enemies. And in order for everyone to bear this in mind, when Jenin created its propaganda department, it followed the tracks of Maghreb, and they called it Al-Halaka Media, in order to refer to that battle in 1086 in Badajoz, where the troops from Northern Africa humiliated the Christian soldiers of King Alphonse VI. So to conclude, when we analyze these actions of jihadists in the Sahel, we must not confuse the issue. The fact that there's a distant menace does not make it a distant reality. We have had many examples of the tremendous threat of jihadist networks setting down in parts of the world from where to threaten others. we have made a reference to actions involving Spain, and this is something that is a source of concern. But there is good news. We, as yet, have not reached the point of no return. Action is possible, and I hope that meetings such as this one, this Forum on Global Terrorism, ensure that we raise awareness so as to ensure that our country responds, our country, its partners, and its allies. Thank you very much to the attention that you've paid to us, and I am, of course, available for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manuel, for your brilliant presentation and for having clarified so many things. It is a very interesting idea, what you mentioned initially in your words about the segmentation of audiences and differentiating between a local audience and a global one, and how messages adapt to all. For sure, the last idea that you mentioned in your conclusions is that being far away does not mean that the threat is also far away. You're also talking about Al-Andalus and facts and battles, and they also use those as a symbol in order to name their own media structures. No doubt it is a fact that underlines, underpins the importance of what you're stating. I'd like to make use of this opportunity to remind you that you can send via email or via Twitter the questions for the different speakers of the second panel. We're getting them, actually, we're processing them. Please do send questions for the participants, or rather for the panelists of this second roundtable. And now I'm going to give the floor to Commander Gerardo Otero, who is in Mali, and I'm sure that he is listening to me now. Are you, Commander? Yes, good afternoon. Good afternoon. It is a great pleasure. Can you hear me? Yes, perfectly well. From Madrid, and I hope that you also can listen to us well. Can you hear us? Yes, yes, perfectly well. I'm not going to take any of your time. I'd just like to thank you once again on behalf of all of the institutions that are involved in the organization and the academic co-directors, the fact that you are involved from the field operations. You've been on the field operations for 12 years, right? So you, I'm sure, are going to be able to need your 12 minutes in order to talk about the field threat or the on-the-ground threat. Thank you. You have the floor, Commander. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving us the opportunity for addressing to you from Bamam, which is the capital of Mali, in order to explain to you how we see the threat from the ground or from the field, and what is the danger for the Spanish interest in Mali, in the most punished region with jihadism. I'm going to make a brief summary of what brought me here. I got here 12 years ago, working initially against massive migration that they were sending towards the Canary Islands in 2007. In 2009, I came back here, and unfortunately, at the same time, 3 Spaniards in Mauritania were kidnapped. At that point in time, back then, the foreign policy in Spain, or politics rather in Spain, started to develop a strategy, because they realized that the national security was threatened here. Within the strategic framework established in Spain in 2010, the Spanish government and the Civil Guard with the European Union sent me to Sahel in order to work on struggle against terrorism and security and border control, initially from the EU, then afterwards in the G5 Sahel and the 5 countries of Sahel, and presently as an assistant coordinator of Garci Sacer, the European project. All of you know where Sahel is. 5,200 kilometers long and 1,000 kilometers wide. that goes through 11 countries from Mauritania to Ethiopia. All of them with same problems: bad governance, corruption, absence of the rule of law, lack of presence of the state in many areas, explosive demographic growth, million of unemployed youth with scarce expectations to improve, an easy result of terrorist groups that operate in the area, and they join those terrorists just because they're desperate, not because they really have the believing. Draft once and again because of the climate change that generates famine, and very permeable borders where there's practically no control. They were drawn from the decolonization with lines and without considering the tribes, the different ethnicities that live in all of them, because they've never been acknowledged. All of these circumstances have been used by jihadists that after the time when they lost their grounds in the Near East, they have decided to come here in order to coordinate their attacks in northern Mali and in the neighboring countries. They also have easy access to arms and explosives after the conflicts of Syria and Libya. And you see how Sahel is a region that becomes a very unstable area, which is the culture, perfect culture, so that on this territory all types of criminal groups get established. To that threat, we need to add another threat, a very silent one, which is advancing from 2011, which are the ideologies coming from the Gulf countries, the indoctrination in Salafi thinking is influencing on Mali, which used to be moderate in its message, but now it is turning towards a much closer type of Islam, which is much closer to jihadist ideologies. The previous data takes Sahel as the biggest security threat for all of Africa, and because of the proximity to all of Europe, Spain is the entry gate, which is closest. The data facilitated by the Center of Strategic Studies in Africa proved that in 2019, the terrorist attack activity in Sahel has grown so much that it has displaced Somalia as the main theater of operations of jihadism in Africa. If we just focus on Mali, which is the country where I live, and the Taco-Burma region, which includes the three borders of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, the security threats come from several fronts. On the one hand, firstly, we have the terrorist groups who have the area as the epicenter for jihadist violence. On the other hand, on a second threat level, we have the conflicts of interest, social stress or tension, and ethnical murders due to internal struggles between ethnias and tribes because of the fact that it's very different the way they live. The Pel, for instance, are farmers, others are fishers, others are cattle growers. Jihadists have found in the rural areas from the north and the center of Ghana the perfect ground to expand their ideas, creating local militia that have found in jihad the perfect excuse in order to oppose themselves to the Mali state and ask for the rights on things such as conflicts because of the farming lands. Very often internal conflicts therefore are mixed together with terrorist actions, are confused. Another group that is posing a threat are the armed groups of independentist origin, such as the National Movement of Liberation of Azawad that declared the independence of the north of Mali, turning this area into an nom-slam, or no one's land, where all types of illicit activities are made. The final threat, finally, is criminality, organized crime, dedicated to all type of illicit trafficking and illegal activities, drugs, human trafficking, weapons, theft, drugs, medicine, false medicines, which are moving around the belt of Sahel. All of these armed groups that we've talked about struggle for the control of a flourishing station in criminal activities in such a way that it is difficult to find the turning points between the drug dealers, the organized crime, criminals, independents, and jihadists, especially in those areas where the presence of the state is scarce or almost inexistent, and where these groups give to the population the security, medical aid, and first needs that they don't get. And as a payment, they get blind faithfulness to these organizations. After I've explained the situation and the place where we're living, we Spaniards in Mali, I'm going to tell you that the agenda in foreign policy in Spain locates Sahel in first line. Our development is dedicated to security and defense, basically, but also to the extent that security of movement, if we are safe to move, if we can do it, we do cooperation to development, security of food and agriculture, and health. The presence of Spanish citizens in Mali presently represents approximately 400, including military, security forces of Spain in different projects, and diplomats, the Spanish Agency of Cooperation, and civilians who are in the country for whatever reason. The threat against the Spanish community and the interests of Spain in Mali, it's clear, and it's very big, not only in Mali but also in the entire region. The messages of Islamic State to the different subsidiaries, most recent one less than 1 month ago, they're continuing with their threats, with messages asking people to go against the Crusades. That's how they call us, the Western countries in Europe, and the Christians. In their strategy of fighting against the unfaithful, the jihadists try to instill in the populations of countries such as Mauritania, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, a growing anti-French feeling, that is to say, via groups that defend anti-colonialism. In Mali, there's a movement which is called France Dégage, that calls demonstrations and incites to hatred to everything that comes from France. But we need to understand something in this region. A French person is anybody who is white in skin and looks like a European, no matter whether they're Russian or American or whatever nationality. To them, we're all French, and therefore we are a target. If they're mad and they just want to be protagonists, they will just go for us. In these last few years, jihadist terrorism has been established in Mali in a dangerous way, in the north and in the center. They're getting mixed with the ethnic conflicts in the country, and they're linking to criminal, organized crimes in Mali. The terrorism that started in Mali as an exogenous phenomenon coming from Middle East presently becomes an internal phenomenon, because it is part of the social fabric of the Mali criminality, turning Mali into the epicentrum of terrorism. More than 1 month ago, 4 terrorists were released. The head of Mali terrorism, Sophie Tepranen, who was a journalist, in exchange for 204 terrorism that have been released in Mali, and a big amount of euros, approximately 10 million euros. There's been this swap of prisoners, which is for us Europeans who are living in Spain that are suffering 3 consequences. It's a threat. Number one, they have 204 new martyrs. They can now have money to buy more weapons to continue fighting. And to me, the biggest threat is the fact that they may come back to 2009, where they are going to probably go back to kidnapping Western people to obtain profits. Back then, kidnaps were not even protagonized by the terrorists. They were just protagonized by criminals who just sold them, depending on the nationality, for whatever amount, so that the terrorists afterwards negotiated. On the other hand, if we analyze the jihadist situation, we need to say that Bamako is on the spot. Jihadist groups that have an enormous amount of material from the last actions are moving towards the central part of the country and the eastern and western part. They are positioning themselves around the capital, where we have the centers of the organizations, the international government organizations, with big projects such as the one where I am involved. Sea, Sahel, and so on. We might be the target for terrorists, clearly, and that might have an important mediatic repercussion, which is what they want. Finally, I'd like to say that for Spain, the stability of Mali is key, because it is a geographic border between sub-Saharan Africa and the north of the continent. Therefore, working on Mali security means that we are refraining jihadism towards Morocco and Maghreb. The presence of the Spanish and the French governments in the international summit about Sahel organized by G5 last June the 30th proves the importance for Spain of what happens in this region. The fact that we have had a coup d'etat in Mali is worrying for us, very worrying, because the uncertainty is growing about which is going to be the future and the main problem that the country has, which is the extension of the jihadist threat. From my point of view, the strategy should focus in adopting adequate responses to increase governance, a struggle against corruption, so that we continue with the projects to refrain the jihadist terrorism or any other type of crime in the region. But the experience proves that we need to also combine it with development projects coordinated hand in hand with the security projects, so that we get to stabilize the population in the area and restore the presence of the state. The project I'm working in right now, we're trying to coordinate, as I explained, and for the time being, the results are being very promising. Unfortunately, sometimes we have some problems. By the way, I'd like to remind you of the 6 colleagues from the gendarmerie that have died recently, have been killed recently. The community that lives here acknowledges their task. Development projects, improvements in health and education, if we coordinate ourselves well, it is necessary for the populations where we're going to carry out our action to be involved in the petitions or requests. My experience suggests that very often development projects are made from the capital, and the capital very often does not know the true need of the rural areas which are farther away from the capital, where the state is really not present. That is why I would like to ask for the projects to be well designed, so that the population that really needs it get the aid that really needs. All of this would lead us to a clear revolution in the migration movements towards our border, which is a real problem right now. So those of us who are working in the region need to accept or face the risks, but I'd like to insist that on the website of the Foreign Affairs Ministry, it is not advised for any travelers to come to Sahel or Mali. That's all. We need to work so as to avoid the jihadist threat to be consolidated, which is nowadays Mali or Nigeria, but the future is Spain, maybe. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you so very much. This was a very thorough and enthusiastic assessment. Definitely, we in Madrid understood how intense living and working on the ground is. You've underscored throughout your address how important it is to be there on site. There's a few messages that I think are takeaways. The threat to Spain is obvious and evident and high. And this combination of an anti-French feeling, which is combined with an anti-European response, and also the complexity of the threat, where the dividing line among the different phenomena are difficult to tell. And it's absolutely essential to have a comprehensive response that links up security elements and, of course, development angles. So thank you very much to Principal Superintendent Rodriguez. Thank you very much. There will hopefully be time for questions, but I'm going to give the floor now first to Manuel Rodriguez. He has talked about the threat which is generated on site, but we are going to hear about another threat, the threat in Spain, the potential threat in Spain. the threat which stems from the Sahel. So we are now back in Spain. You have the floor, sir. Principal Superintendent, you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you very much, Carola, for those kind words. I'm delighted to share this virtual panel with Manuel Torres and with Gerardo Otero. For Commander of the Civil Guard and all of his team there, thank you. Thank you, and our acknowledgement because you are there in the front line. My contribution, I think, is going to have very much to do with information, although I have to say that the threat which is going to ensue for Spain after what we've heard discussed this afternoon is not very concrete, but it does affect very many areas above and beyond information. I address the issue of the National Police, the Department General for Information. It encompasses all different areas of state activities. I have to speak about something which is delicate. I have to explain what I think is going to be the result of everything we are addressing now, but without alarming anyone. So let me summarize and say that our research and investigation, when we think about possible future criminal actions to be carried out in Spain, I have to say that in the near future, distant, hopefully, because of the Sahel conflicts, we're just going to deal with it as we would any other terrorist threat. We are going to investigate what we can within the legal framework that we are allowed in our democracy. And what else do we do apart from investigation? Well, let me see. If I virtually go beyond the borders, and of course, always in accordance with the rule of law, we investigate crimes which are not committed exclusively on Spanish territory. And specifically, with regard to Sahel, we have had, indeed, unfortunately, to investigate the kidnapping by ACME, and these cases are all proceedings in the Audiencia Nacional. Also in 2011, the Tindouf attacks, and in 2014, Libya. So these are cases that have occurred, and I need also to make a reference to other criminal actions, not only in Sahel. So Akrana, for instance, back in 2009, that was Al-Sabad, and then 2014, Syria, the 3 Spanish journalists who were victims. So as our colleague Manuel Torres has said, this is a threat that is neither close nor far away. We have found Indonesian nationals in Spain. We know that this is definitely a possibility. Other activities that we carry out, far from the border, but which in this specific case are affected by circumstances, well, it's lese humanitae and genocides, which in this case are easy enough to witness in these countries. And we know that this is being tracked. Now, another chapter, and really not thinking only about potential future crimes, whatever comes to us from the Sahel is going to be problematic, but information units or intelligence units, we also track those crimes that has to do with proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, illicit traffic of arms and weapons, initially when the crime itself has not happened, and then also the control of precursors, explosive precursors. Why do we address these issues? Well, because there have been some recent operations in which there are connections with the Sahel, and I have selected them because of this reason. As to proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, our security forces are involved in the board to regulate foreign trade, targeting conventional and non-conventional double-use material. As to countries of the Sahel, they are not the object of requests for licenses for this type of material or double-use material. Usually, the material, I'm talking about Spanish companies, it's usually because there is a triangulation of the exports. There is false information, and because of the tracked activity of these organizations, we know that it's not usually the recipient who actually has ordered. We, of course, are tracking very closely the acquisition and purchasing of drones. These are elements that are desirable. In other words, criminals like drones. It's also true that often enough, as I said before, we triangulate and we track this material to destination countries. Originally, state entities are the official purchasers when at the end that material, those articles are going to be sent to criminal groups. In the Sahel, what we see is the export of weapons for hunting. I need to make a reference to Burkina Faso, which is a very sensitive country. In the transactions that are tracked in this interministerial group, and we need carefully to study how congruent the acquisition is, the volume, who buys the material, because there's millions of euros involved. And these are countries also where much of the material actually is received by the rightful owner. And then proliferation, well, we need to make a reference to exemptions and the embargoes, the UN and the EU respectively. These are countries in the Sahel. We've only got Sudan, which is subject to resolution, and that was the result of a conflict, a racial conflict, specifically in Darfur. And then there is another issue, which is weapons trafficking. I have to make a reference to a transaction a week ago. The Policía Nacional and the Mossos de Escuadra, and with our customs authorities. It was material coming from the Ukraine, and the final recipient was these organizations. As I said before, these transactions are possible thanks to triangulation, and there was defense material, there were tanks actually involved, and if this material reaches the terrorist organizations, this is terrible. As to explosive precursors, I wanted to say that it's not prevention, because this is investigation, and this is beyond our national boundaries. And I talk about this issue because there's rules in place, the European Union and the Council of Europe, back in 2013, and what we are doing is we're ensuring that all suspicious transactions are tracked involving precursors. What happens when these transactions are not informed about? So what happened in Alcala back in 2017? And we're thinking now, I'm focusing on the Sahel because these are terrorist actions, and these are persons who were from the Sahel. We may see that there will be rebels and so on who will be availing themselves of this. I also talk about precursors because there was within the framework of what has been also described by Professor Torres when talking about propaganda and the web. About a year ago, an editor was arrested in Spain, and when his dwelling was searched, there was a confiscation of precursors that were essential to build bombs. This is one of the components that is essential and sellers are more cautious and do not report to the authorities of the selling and exchanging of these suspect materials. All of these activities are preventive and may well lead us any day to investigating on our soil of someone who, I'm not going to say that they come from a group from the Sahel, say GSIM, etc., but as soon as we see that the nationalities are from those countries which are in fact sending persons who might potentially be dangerous, we will be advised. I talk more about investigation than about what I've been asked to address, which is the threat. As the Secretary of State said, we have a weekly meeting and we all contribute during that meeting. Of course, the CNI contributes. They have real intelligence about what is happening outside of our country. So it is during that group session that we talk about the issues that affect us the most. These circumstances, these events that are taking place in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, in the westernmost part of Africa, well, there's no doubt about it that these are issues that are well known by those entities that have to ensure our safety. But I, as a policeman, must say that what we do is we also analyze what may happen in the near future. And there are factors that are self-evident when we think about the flows of nationals coming from these countries, hypothetical migration of the conflict. In fact, yes, we're very close, so proximity is an issue. We are a pass-through zone for these countries, and we've seen that in all of the investigation carried out when studying persons from sub-Saharan Africa and from other countries too, we see that these persons want to go to France and Belgium and Luxembourg, so that's French-speaking countries, and Spain is there to detect those flows as a buffer. It's also true that unfortunately our borders are permeable. There is a certain permeability for maritime transit. So for weapons of proliferation at the scales, when boats stop, we have to say, and also remember that there is a fair amount of irregular immigration coming to us by sea. And then all of that propaganda that targets us. We've seen for at least 2 years now, we've seen tremendous interference, threats against Spain in Spanish. This is something that we have focused on, definitely. So what is the profile of the rebel who can come here, the combatant? Well, it's going to be different from somebody coming from Syria, for instance. We're talking about city dwellers. Now, if there were to be an Islamic State that would reproduce what happened in Mali in 2012 and what until 2017, what was in place in Syria and Iraq, we're going to have a different profile to deal with. But it's going to be someone who is going to have a very difficult time going undetected, you see, because they will come from a part of the country that is not urban. They're not going to become more radical here. They're not going to have connections or links here or in Europe. And it's going to be very difficult for them to embed themselves. It's going to be more difficult for us to identify them. It's going to be easier for them to be unpredictable. Should they come here, they're going to be more difficult to detect and therefore more dangerous. And then another problem is the displaced persons, asylum seekers, refugee seekers. This is something that Spain must take into account. And just remember, please, that there were attacks in 2017 in Stockholm, the truck. It was an Uzbek who was requesting asylum. The terrible attack in Vienna, the Macedonian youth who requested asylum, that, of course, is going to be investigated by our security forces. And very recently in the Canary Islands, we have arrested a Moroccan national who had requested asylum in Germany. And what other problems are there to speak about? Well, inclusion. The inclusion of these future Sahelian combatants in the flows returning from Syria, those returning from Syria, who use the same channels. And then there's something which is very specific, which is their nationalities. These are countries that do not have identity control mechanisms in place as other countries do. So, availing by terrorists of false documents, artificial documents is easy. Counterfeit documents are easy to access. And should they be arrested, it's very difficult to know where to send them because the countries don't want them back and don't acknowledge that they are nationals. So that process is actually paralyzed. These are factors that are a source of concern. But I think that there is a light at the end of the tunnel because not everything is a source of concern. We do have cause for hope. There have been arrests recently. In the past few years, there's been one Senegalese in 2017, and this was thanks to an operation which targeted a group of indoctrinators up in the Basque Country and the Moroccan in 2013 who got in touch with an ACME specialist in a recruitment action in Murcia. So what we see is that we're talking about Moroccans basically. And then if we think about persons who are sent out, our legislation in place for foreign nationals, when we think about national security, as of 2015, we have seen that a Nigerian, 3 Egyptians have been deported. So what I mean to say here is that the number of persons who have been investigated is not undue. And what else could I say? What else is there to mention? Well, Morocco and Algeria are allies in the fight against terrorism. The activity of the combatants, in principle, in the desert would never be similar to what we see happening in cities. And military operations carried out by the United States of America and others are important. We see that some of the leaders have been put down. And the numbers, I think, speak for themselves. They allow us to understand that we have not had an attack on Spanish soil ever since 2017, thank goodness. So my message is that we should not be unduly concerned. The state is doing everything it can do to ensure that nothing terrible happens here, terrible things that are happening in other parts of the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for the very thorough presentation. I was remembering while I heard you talk about the global phenomenon that you said that none arrested person had been in Spain, but one arrested had been trained in Indonesia. So yes, it is true that how we see that there's a global dimension, specifically in the Dátil operation carried out by the National Police Force. I don't want to take any more from the Q&A time because we have a little bit delay. And the first question is for Professor Manuel Torres. It is a question that we get by email. And the person who sends it is asking, are there any specific messages for the recruitment of individuals that are investigated in Spain? Are jihadist organizations that are established in Sahel sending this type of recruitment messages geared towards these individuals? The question is also asking, what would be the most attractive profile for these organizations? Probably second generations coming from immigrants coming from these countries, such as in Syria? I'm going to make use of this opportunity to ask another question for Commander Otero. This time the question comes via Twitter, and it has to do with the functions carried out by the Army on the local population. more specifically, do you have any, do they have any tasks related to integration? You tackled the issue of kidnapping during the presentation. How much do they earn with the kidnapping? How could we solve the conflict or the problem of this kidnapping? And finally, for the Commissioner, actually, we would like to ask you about police operations and foreign terrorist fighters. But actually, you answered the question during your presentation. We got some question about the potential detection with migration flows of individuals who might have had some connection with active jihadist organizations in Sahel. So the first goes for Manuel Torres. You have the floor. Manuel Torres, Professor of Political Science. Actually, do you know what? The most similar thing to a communique or a statement trying to call the Muslims living in Spain is a video that I mentioned during my presentation, which especially has to do with the origin of it is the residency, because the person who wrote that statement was from Melilla, because the other calls for Muslims living in the West are more or less general appeals. They invite the Muslims living in unfaithful land to join the armed forces and so on. But the propaganda environment is such a fluid thing that the arrival of a militant with their specific ideas about how to improve the discourse and try to segment it better, that might change actually the situation quickly. The second question, the data suggests that the radicalization discourse has been more successful actually, yes, in the second generations, because they have more identity crisis. And so this type of simple but powerful narrative identifying that people do not belong to one nation or another, but rather that they are Muslims and their duty is to fight against the enemies of the religion. Unfortunately, that type of discourse or statement has been more successful in people of second and third generations, Muslims living in Western countries. Finally, I'd like to say that actually the basic problem of this discourse or statements that they've drafted in Sahel, the problem is not so much that they're going to generate a flow towards this area, but rather the feedback it has with other radical networks that already exist in other countries. Many of these people who have not necessarily had to displace to the Sahel, or maybe they have not even had a direct contact with the organizations that operate in this field, but maybe they believe that if they organize an attack in their countries, they can contribute to the fight that their brothers and sisters carry out in those other countries. So the more the propaganda flow is perfected, the more dangerous it is that this ends up feeding the jihadist violence in unsuspected places, especially Spain, for instance. Thank you very much, Manuel. Commander Otero, once again, let's go back to Mali, please. Hi again. I've been asked two questions. I'll try to answer. Number one, what is the mission of the army vis-a-vis the populations, right? Well, actually, the national defense of the territory, that's the goal of an army. The population have suffered in these countries clearly the attack of the state, actually. There's been violence committed against these populations when there's war, unfortunately. It shouldn't happen, but there's this type of situations, to be honest. In my view, with the population, we need to act with the security forces who are really going to do what we call a proximity work with the populations. For instance, the project that I'm working with, GSIM, we work with the populations that are far away from the state, that they are left over, ignored, doing little things like moving a sick person to a hospital, which is the reason why the last 2 people from the gendarmerie were killed. Facilitating aspirin or paracetamol or painkillers. Just with these little actions that seem absurd and negligible, but you can't imagine how much you can do with the population. The population is so thankful, and that is what we try to teach when we train the police forces that are going to work here. The second question about kidnaps, what would I do? I wouldn't do what they're doing, actually, to be honest, but the states are free to act as they wish. There's something which is clear. Paying for a ransom is a business, becomes a negotiating with the kidnapped people becomes a business. Sometimes we states have to accept that if it were our husband or son, we would do anything. We would pay any ransom for sure. I'm sure that if we were honest, we would all admit that we would pay for the ransom, obviously. But the reality is that papers who don't pay have less kidnapped persons than those who pay for ransoms. We know that those who don't pay ransoms are automatically the country who does not pay ransoms. They're going to be sacrificed. They're going to be killed. We know. But there's something which is clear. In 2009, we were called Spanish, Italian, and French who paid for the ransoms. We were called Mouton Gras, and the UK were called Mouton Serre, because we would be killed and the others would be used in order to get money. We would be sacrificed, and that's how they called us. How should we react in the kidnapping? Well, it's difficult. The ideal would be not to pay any ransom, nor negotiating with the terrorists. That way we would finish with these actions. It would be of no use. They wouldn't be funded also. But states are free. Thank you very much, Commander Otero. Now I'm going to give the floor again to the police commissioner. Okay, you're asking me whether the migration irregular networks are used by terrorists? Yes, the answer is yes, but irregular migration networks bring irregular migrants. Maybe there's a couple of terrorists that are going there, but that's not their express dedication. Terrorists have capabilities to get fake identity and financing coming even from their countries of origin and their destination countries too in Europe. And they have that extra capacity or capability to use these migration networks more probably than other migrants who have no money to pay for that. But we need to differentiate the migrants who come into Spain and then go through radicalization processes later, make crimes sometimes that have to do with terrorism. That may happen, but it is certainly not related to the fact that they have come, that there's been foreign fighters coming into Spain directly brought with the migration networks? Well, yes, maybe there's some exceptions. I know about two brothers from Morocco in 2018, another one in the Canary Islands from 2005, but they're the exception to the rule. And the last one was in April, where we got 3 fighters that were returned because at the end of 2019 they had been in Turkey and in Syria. So yes, in 4 months they had to return, and from the investigations we know that they did return with the regular migration networks. Thank you very much for your answer. And with this, I'm going to conclude the second panel, and I'm going to give the floor to the director of the Elcano Royal Institute, Charles Powell, who's here in order to close the session. Thank you to the 3 panelists and to the attendants that have been listening to us both physically here, present in the room, and also via streaming. Thank you very much.
Very good, thank you. Good afternoon, all. I think that the time has come now to formally close this seminar, the 8th Elcano Forum on Global Terrorism. But before I do so, let me thank Carola Garcia Calvo and Fernando Renares for organizing this seminar. Thank you also to the Embassy of the United States of America for once again being with us. And thank you to the Instituto Internacional I always like to say that this is one of my favorite places in Madrid, and perhaps today even more so, even in these new normal times. Now, with us to close this session is our good friend Fidel Santagorta, who is a Spanish diplomat, has been for decades, just back from a year in Harvard with a book under his arm, which is The Way You Return from Harvard. A very interesting book indeed, which we presented a few weeks ago about the strategic triangle, China, the US, and Europe. At this point, Fidel Santagorta is General Director of Foreign and Security Policy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, European Union, and Cooperation of Spain. Thank you very much to Fidel Santagorta. I know that whenever we reach out to Fidel, he responds very favorably, and as always, we are deeply in debt. Thank you very much, Charles. I have to say that I'm very happy to be with you. I thought that this forum was tremendously interesting. I liked hearing the different points of views that the speakers shared with us. I have to say that I have seen the evolution of the Sahel over the past 10 years. 10 years ago, I was Director General for Northern Africa and the Middle East, and I visited some of the countries, Mauritania, of course, and Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and others. And at that point in time, terrorism was a spin-off from jihadist terrorism in Algeria. The leaders were Algerian for the most part. So this was a phenomenon that was visible in the Arab tribes and perhaps in some that were up in the northern part of the Sahel. But I have to say that as we've seen and as we've heard this afternoon, the explosion begins when the Libyan regime implodes. I was at that point serving as ambassador in Egypt, and I do remember my final interview in Egypt. This is back in 2014 with General Sisi, who was at that point president of Egypt, who rapped our knuckles, European ambassadors rapped our knuckles, saying that you dismantled the regime that was in place, a good one or a bad one, you packed your bags and you left us immersed in chaos. So that was one of the strategic errors, the greater strategic errors to have been committed by Europe and the United States, who backed, leading from behind, as President Obama said, but that was an unfortunate mess. So, 10 years after the fact, we look at these issues again, we talk about security, and I see the growth, the exponential growth of the phenomenon in question. We're talking about 1,300 lives lost 2 years ago, 4,500 last year. So that's growth. And we're also seeing a notable growth also in the scale, because it's not just the 5 countries in the Sahel. No, now we're talking about growth towards the south, Togo, Benin, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, of course, and in Eastern Africa, Mozambique, at this point, a challenge from jihad, no matter how we look at it. So what we're seeing is at a continental scale. So obviously what we need to do is concentrate our presence in the Sahel, because there are major problems that have been referred to in the seminar today. But at the end of the day, problem number 1 is the weakness of states. That is the most important issue that we need to bear in mind. And it was interesting to think about the Sahel and the presence of the civil guard there. We understand where it is that we need to focus on in order to contribute not only to strengthening a state. No, what we want is for a state to exist which doesn't exist in huge swathes of the territories of these countries. There is no state. We find ourselves also in the following situation. As I say, 10 years ago, we assessed these issues and we thought that this was an issue that affected the Arab tribes, maybe the Tuaregs, and back then that's how it was, but now it has reached out and includes the Zulami, sub-Saharan populations. They are recruited systematically in these groups, in Shinimi and in the Islamic State of Greater Sahara, ISGS. I was shocked over these past years. Now that I'm back to studying these issues, I was shocked by seeing that the leader of Daesh in the Sahel is from the Sahara, from the Saharan camps. He has been recruited. That is where they have sought for their men. This is their nursery, as it will. I saw them when I was posted in Cuba. They went to Cuba for training. They were nationalists, maybe socialists from the third world, but I had never seen this twist. I had never seen this ideological Islamist, definitely not this jihadist angle. And this is something that is a source of concern because it is very close to our world, our cultural world, our strategic world. I do not want to take up too much of your time. I have to say that everything I was going to say has been said by the previous speakers, but I would underscore the importance of two ideas. First, let me say that the hard work underway in the Sahel, I'm talking about hard work and endeavors in the field of security. Well, that's European. The UN is involved also, but this is a European burden. And it's good news to know that we're going to be receiving help from outside. That would be the coalition against Daesh. The best practices that have been learned in the fight against Daesh in Syria and Iraq, we are studying to see how they may be made extensive to the Sahel. So, for instance, when it comes to collection of evidence and proof for court proceedings, which does not exist at this point in time, and also in border control and also in financing of terrorist activities. We have not as yet defined what areas we will be contributing to, but I think that it's very good that we be able to acknowledge that all of these efforts will bear fruit. And then there's NATO. On December 1st and 2nd, the ministerial is going to discuss how we can back efforts underway in the Sahel. It is true that there is complex coordination involving the different international procedures in place, but I think it's fair to say that NATO will always think about value added and not duplicating efforts, but there is definitely room for the using of resources within NATO. There's intelligence, there's airlifts, there's training, there's all manner of resources that are very, very valuable and which we warmly welcome. And then secondly, I think we need to have experts, create experts in this part of the world. It was pretty well overnight that Spain landed in Afghanistan, in a country which was completely unknown to Spain. It was at a great distance from our historical strategic concerns, but we had to deploy there with thousands of troops, as you well know, and we cooperated very well with development in mind. We had to create our experts in Afghanistan who are still there. I think that this investment was perhaps not that fruitful because there's not much now, but when we talk about the Sahel is so close to us. That advanced defense that other speakers talked about, that's our security that's at stake. I do think that the experts in the Sahel are going to be experts who will be experts forever. We need them now, and we're going to need them now, as I say, and very much into the future. And let me just add something. These are the reasons that explain the surfacing of these terrorist activities in the Sahel. We've seen them here: climate change, desertification, population explosion, demographics, a weakened state, interethnic conflict. But actually, what I wonder about is why this new ideology? Why this ideology which is so foreign to these countries? The answers I am given, there's poverty. Well, poverty had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda's number one came from one of the richest families in Saudi Arabia, and number two was a doctor, an Egyptian doctor, upper middle class. And that has nothing to do with poverty or with being needy, which, would have thrown him into the arms of the rebel life. So I don't have an answer. I think it would be very interesting to research this, and I think that the Elcano, in its quest for useful knowledge for Spain, might think about this issue, because we do need experts. We need to understand why this jihadist movement has come to the surface. Why has it blossomed? The conditions were not there that we would normally associate with this ideology. So what is the link with other factors? Say, for instance, interethnic problems in the region. These are two ideas that I would like all of you to take home with you and ponder upon them. Again, let me congratulate the Elcano Forum. Thank you very much to the Embassy of the United States of America for contributing to the success of this seminar. This is a great initiative. Thank you very much, and congratulations. Thank you, Fidel. When we talk about the Sahel, I always like to remember a visitor. He was from the US, who told us that many years ago, the situation in the Sahel had deteriorated tremendously, basically for three reasons, fairly straightforward: satellite phones, GPS, and Toyota, the Land Cruiser, which had turned what used to be a barrier into a road, a 6-lane road, good for trafficking and anything, good for any kind of terrorist activity. Thank you. Unfortunately, our time has run out. Thank you very much indeed to all of you who have been with us virtually. Thank you very much. I have been here ever since 4:30. I was very comfortable in my office, I have to acknowledge. So there is always a silver lining, and this pandemic will allow us, I think, to reach out to larger audiences than we could reach out to if we were here physically in real life, as I say. So thank you, Fidel. Thank you very much to the speakers. Congratulations to the organizers and to the Elcano team for their wonderful work. Thank you all, and good afternoon.